Hello, and welcome to another in a series of panel discussions sponsored by Indivisible South Bay. These discussions are meant to explore the many ways in which we at Indivisible South Bay are coping with the election of the 2016 election results. Our discussion this time will be with our own Lisa Ferino and two special guests from National Voter Corps, a locally founded grassroots organization dedicated to the protection of voting rights and to the exposure and elimination of voter suppression all across the country. My name is Eitan Fenson. I've been a tech startup engineer, entrepreneur, and executive here in Silicon Valley for 30 years. For much of that time, I have also been an activist for social and economic justice. At the other end of the table is Lisa Ferino, my co-director here at Indivisible South Bay. Lisa is also Outreach and Communications Coordinator for National Voter Corps. In the minuscule spare time that she has, Lisa is an educator and a videographer. Sitting next to Lisa is Nervana Nurse, 50-state project coordinator for National Voter Corps. Nervana is also a counselor and a child advocate. Finally, sitting next to Nervana is Ellen Deering Wallau, National Group Liaison for National Voter Corps. Ellen has a master's in social work, is a volunteer, an HR director, and a small business owner. She gets around. As always, if this show makes you want to get out of your chair, join with your friends, and act to make positive, progressive change, then we will have accomplished something. Okay, let's get to National Voter Corps. Lisa, what is National Voter Corps and how did it get started?
Thank you, Eitan. Well, National Voter Corps started right after the 2016 election when some very distraught local citizens met to talk about what they could do to change the situation in this country. And one of those people, Alice Smith, who's a veteran activist in the local community, stood up and said that she wanted to start a group that worked on voting rights because there's a crisis in this country where voting rights are concerned. And I loved her passion, and I said, I'm following this woman because she presented a really good case for putting together a national group, actually. And it's modeled on the Peace Corps in the sense that she wanted to create an army of volunteers, thousands of them across the country, who go out and help voters to register, to get IDs, and to get to the polls, and even to have volunteers watching at polls to make sure that the voting was happening the way it's supposed to. And so maybe we could have the first slide, if that would be possible. So National Voter Corps' three-pronged approach has been to educate the public about the problem, and we've put on a lot of public events already, including one in November with Ari Berman, who's a leading national journalist talking about voting rights.
That was an outstanding event.
A lot of people are familiar with his work. He's written for the New York Times and Mother Jones, and he's written a book called Give Us the Ballot, which is an excellent book on the history since the Voting Rights Act of voting rights in the country. So to educate the public and to form coalitions with like-minded organizations that are working on voting rights. There are many of them. And to also mobilize those armies that Alice envisioned that will work on specific projects related to voting in different parts of the country.
An ambitious objective. So now that we have an idea as to what National Voter Corps is, I'd like to hear how and why you got involved. So Nervana, can you tell us why did you get involved?
I got involved probably because of the way a whole lot of other people got involved. Sitting there watching the returns coming in on the elections, and ended up screaming at my TV constantly, day after day afterwards. And Cecilia, my Doberman pincher, she started getting offended by it. So I decided I needed to figure out a way how to express my energy and my disappointment somewhere else. And I had an idea that I wanted to get in touch with the people who had the most egregious acts presented to them in the country. And the best venue I found was National Voter Corps.
That's cool. Ellen, how about you?
Oh, similarly, you know, with the election, I was pretty frustrated and horrified and shocked, and spent, you know, day in and day out obsessively watching the television and reading everything I could, waiting for the other shoe to drop and waiting, you know, for the nightmare to be over. And, you know, that didn't happen. And my family kind of...
It hasn't happened yet?
Yeah, no, not yet. And my family, you know, got really tired of listening to me rant and rage over this. And one of the things that I did was go to the Women's March right away.
Yeah.
A friend of mine who lives in Washington offered her place, and I booked a flight and went to Washington. And I was really energized and excited by that, but I came home and I felt like I needed to do something.
Right.
I wanted to do more, and I just serendipitously ran into Alice, the founder of this group, at a restaurant, and I overheard her talking about it, and I went up and asked her to tell me a little bit more.
Right.
And I was excited by the idea of building this army of people to go out and help people vote, get voter IDs, get to the polls, and so forth. So she sent me you know, an email and information about the next meeting, and I went, and I've been involved ever since.
Cool. Lisa, finally, how about you?
Well, I was also very upset after the election, but I'll go back further and look back to 2004, where I volunteered for the John Kerry campaign in Cleveland, and was given duty to watch a polling place in Cleveland where it was predominantly African American, and they were standing in the rain for 2 hours, and there were really long lines, and there was a problem at the polling place, and it just was kind of a nightmare. And I said, does this happen often? And they said, yeah, it does, you know. And so something started, you know, working in my brain, where I noticed in the paper that there were problems across the country with long lines that usually you don't find in California. And then in 2016, after the election, I went to an event where my congressperson was speaking, and I asked him, what do you think about voter suppression? Did that have an impact on the election results? And he said, we don't want to even talk about that. That really wasn't the problem. The problem was Hillary not going out and campaigning in the swing states like she should have. And the way he just shut down any talk of voter suppression, I thought, that can't be right. And so I started doing research, and the more I researched, the more horrified I was to see how much voter suppression there is in this country. And we could maybe put up the second slide.
Yeah, speaking of that, if you can elaborate as to what is the voter suppression problem in our country, can you give us a sense of what it is?
Well, it's really an enormous nightmare for a lot of people. It pretty much started, and we could maybe have the third slide go up. It started roughly in 2010, the latest wave of voter suppression, in 2010 with the rise of the Tea Party, but it was severely aggravated in 2013 with the Shelby County versus Holder decision. It's a Supreme Court ruling which ruled that states with long histories of racial discrimination no longer had to seek approval from the federal government for changes to their voting laws and procedures. 9 states were under that, what's called pre-clearance,
Right.
and 6 other states had some counties involved with that. So
that ruling always struck me as being kind of the Stephen Colbert in character from the old Colbert Report, saying, I don't see race. And this was the Roberts Court saying, we don't see race. And it just smacks of hypocrisy, and I can see how that would be particularly frustrating.
Right, that's what they used as justification. They said there's not a problem anymore with voting in those states. But in fact, right after it was passed, a number of states jumped in and passed extremely suppressive voting laws. Texas, North Carolina, other states pop to mind. But we have a situation now where in 2011, just 2 states required voter ID to vote. Now it's up to 34 states. And that's a huge change. It affects about 23 million. 23 million people in the country are having trouble getting voter IDs. That's 11% of the voting public. It's an enormous number of people. And that's just the tip of the ice. Well, that's just one of the problems.
Right. Right.
So maybe we could have the next slide come up. And I think that one is looking at the states that were affected by the Voting Rights Act, but after Shelby County versus Holder was passed, 2016 is the first election that we've had in 50 years without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
It had an enormous impact.
Right.
And Nervana can speak a little bit to one of the states that was really impacted by Shelby County versus Holder.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lisa. And that would be North Carolina. And if you watch North Carolina during the elections, they were like, it was like a catalyst. And if you just watch them, you could see everything else that was blooming out throughout the country. Right. Because there was a new governor, and he was a Democratic governor. His name was Goody, I think it was. And he was Democrat, and all of his legislators were Republicans. And as fast as he was trying to get himself acclimated, they were changing the laws around him and pretty much shrinking his power down to the point where he would have to go to court, try to get it changed around. And this was going on in real time. Yeah. You could see it in real time. And it was just, it was stunning to watch because growing up, my dad had to go through this. And now here I was living it. Right. So it was just extraordinary to watch. Mm-hmm. Right. And one of the judges that was in the 4th precinct, I think it was, and she had said, I wrote it down because I wanted to make sure I got it perfectly right. All right. She had said that new provisions target African Americans with almost surgical precision and impose cures for problems that did not exist. And that was Judge Diane Grobin. And you could see it real time, just happening, and it's still going on today.
Well, that's a hallmark of the Trump administration, solving problems that don't exist.
Yeah, exactly.
Unfortunately.
We could have the next slide go up about voter ID in the country.
So now, let's look to the future.
Well, before we do that, I haven't talked about the other problems with voting because it's not just the voter ID situation. Okay. And the problem with voter ID is that people don't realize that the people most severely affected are the already underrepresented voting groups. Right. They're minorities, elderly, youth, and the disabled. Right. So those groups are already vulnerable in our voting system, and with voter ID laws that are very confusing and just expensive in certain states. It's like a poll tax because you have to get a birth certificate. Right. Anyway, it's just not fair. It's not set up in a fair way. That's the problem with voter ID. But the other problems include a shutdown or decrease in early voting in many states, shutdown of polling places. 858 polling places in this country were shut down before the 2016 election. Elimination of DMVs in certain states. In Alabama, that was a huge problem. Shutdown or increasing difficulty of voter registration. Just having a voter registration drive in certain states proved impossible, like Florida. Voter purging in certain states, that was just eliminating legitimate voters from the voter rolls. And cross-check. Now, cross-check is worth talking a little more about. The interstate cross-check system is administered by Chris Kobach, who is perhaps the king of voter suppression in this country. He's Secretary of State of Kansas, but he administers the system which 30 states participate in. And what happens is they send Kobach and the election officials in Kansas their voter registration rolls. These authorities in Kansas compare the voter reg rolls in certain states with other states and their lists. And then it's sent back to the state with matches from other states, first name, last name, and date of birth. The problem is that there are results that show a lot of false positives. It has a risk of disenfranchising large numbers of legitimate voters.
It's not a risk, it's a certainty.
It's a certainty that this happens. And the most who are vulnerable, the most vulnerable are the minority voters, because their names are, they tend to have similar last names more than whites.
But there's also some selection going on. I think that the rules are not applied in a non-discriminatory way. So it isn't just that minority names might be more likely to be purged. There is a purposeful element of this, which unfortunately, there is an awful lot of, hey, we're doing everything fairly, and it is clear that it is not.
Yes, I do think that that's part of the problem. And maybe we could have the next slide go up.
So are we ready to talk about the future? Building National Voter Corps into the future, in particular building the 50-state map. Can you tell us about that?
Okay, this is the fun part. So we decided, one of the first things we were going to do is to try to form a coalition of all the national voting rights groups, ACLU, League of Women Voters, and NAACP, Common Cause. We said, why can't they get together in a room, have a huge conference, press conference, and say, we have a crisis in voting in this country. We need to do something now. We need to issue a red alert and have armies of people get together and do something. That didn't happen. We knocked on their doors, and they're just not understanding what we were asking for. And so we said, well, what can we do on a grassroots level? And so we said, we'll call up voting organizations, whatever we can find in each state, and we'll develop an online map that lists these organizations state by state, so you can click on your state and come up with the list of organizations, of groups that are working on the ground in your state. And so we started making these calls and sending emails back in March or April. Very slow going for the first few months, to the point where we kind of said, what are we doing this for? Why are we doing this? And slowly we started to get some early adopters. And then I would say the dam kind of broke in August or September. So, 6 months later, we started to see some results. And then by December, we were in much better shape. We had organizations in 47 out of 50 states and maybe 90 organizations. Now it's almost 100 organizations. And we're hoping for
That's
200
fabulous.
more,
Absolutely fabulous.
And we could have the next slide go up.
So in the spirit of looking to the future, what about National Voter Corps' plans for 2018? What are we looking at? We can talk a little bit about what happened in at the end of 2017 before we go to 2018. So what happened is that we decided we should call up someone in Virginia, because we knew they were having the state elections there in November, and we said, let's call up Andrea Miller of the NAACP in Virginia, because we had her involved already, and boy, was she busy. She was putting together an online phone bank for the NAACP, and she recruited us to enlist local volunteers to participate in her phone bank, calling African American voters in Virginia just to ask them. It was nonpartisan, because we're a nonpartisan group. Right.
Just to ask them to please go to the polls and vote. And as we know, African Americans made a huge difference in that race.
20% of the electorate for that election was African American.
Right, 20% of the voters were
Right.
African American, whereas they're not that high a percentage of the
It's more
population.
like, what, 12 or 13%?
Right. And so Andrea took that and decided to try to implement it in Alabama. And with Alabama, there's a more complicated story, but an equal success story. So maybe Nervana, you can talk about that while we put up the next slide.
In Alabama, just after Virginia, I called up the CEO or president of the chapter of NAACP in Alabama. Couldn't get a hold of him. Weekend came, tried again on Monday, still couldn't get a hold of him. Left him a couple of messages, and then finally put Andrea Miller on his case.
Oh, right.
Yeah, yeah, and that was probably what opened him up, because I got a phone call. Actually, I got another phone call from Lisa, and she said one more thing needs to be done because they're not budging. And what had happened was he wanted to do the phone bank via paper.
Oh, boy.
And the way that Andrea Miller had it set up is
Computer.
in computer,
Yeah.
in the van system.
She has the IT expertise.
Yes, which goes a lot faster, and I feel it's a lot funner too. And she got it. We went back and forth. We finally got it set up, and Alabama.
Was a huge success.
Exactly.
And it wasn't 20% of the
Exactly.
vote. It was 30%.
Right. It was amazing. It was amazing.
Fabulous.
Right.
So can you tell us a little bit about the Coalition for Underrepresented Voting Groups?
Right. This is the Coalition for Underrepresented Voter Outreach that we have just formed with Andrea, but we have a lot of buy-in from different national voting groups, NAACP, Voto Latino, APIA Vote. There are a number of groups. We're just bringing people together, bringing these organizations together that are already reaching out to different groups of the most vulnerable voters to say, what can we do if we combine our efforts, we pool our resources, what can we actually produce for 2018 and all the midterm elections?
Right.
Andrea actually, started this ball rolling, and she said, "Boy, now we really have to produce, don't we?"
Right.
We had this, almost magical event in Virginia and Alabama, but now we have to see what we can do. And this may be the first time that such an effort has been put together.
Right.
We're not sure, but.
There's another interesting story that's related, and that is about the state of Florida and felons. Ellen, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, one of the states that I've been working on and calling and doing outreach with is Florida. And, I connected with Floridians for a Fair Democracy, and I found out that they were working to get the signatures to get on the ballot an overturn of the state legislature's rule against felons voting. There are about 4+ states where
Ex-felons.
Yeah, where ex-felons, people who are felons, who've served their time,
Right.
who've done their probation, who've done their
Right.
restitution, are still not allowed to vote. They're banned for life in
Right.
4 states,
Right.
Florida being one of them. And in the upcoming election, the Floridians are going to vote to overturn that, hopefully.
Yeah.
But in general, there's about 1.5 million people in Florida that aren't allowed to vote because of this law. And that's way more than what turned the election in 2016.
Absolutely.
And in the country, there's over 6 million people, which is, I think it's about 2.5% of the electoral, of the voters
Right.
of age in this country that cannot vote because of these rules and restrictions. So that was, an eye-opener for me.
Yeah, I'll bet. I'll bet.
They're on our map. They're working with us, too.
So all of this is a message. It's an object lesson in what can be done when one gets active, when one gets engaged. On that note, can we talk a little bit about, let's do a little call to action. What can people do going forward to get involved with National Voter Corps or related activities?
There's so much that people can do. It's hard to know where to start. And we could just put up the last slide, which is a little bit of an inspirational slide with Martin Luther King quote. Basically, we need people to help us make those calls to the 50 states and emails. We just need tons of people to help us with that effort. You know, it's hard to reach out to 50 states.
Yes, indeed.
And build the coalition.
But it's so satisfying when you connect with one of these grassroots groups that's doing fantastic work that nobody has heard of. You know, just as one quick example, you know, I reached out to West Virginia and connected with the League of Women Voters there just recently, and they said, "We're so glad you called because a new voter ID law has been enacted. It takes effect January 2018, and we're going to need volunteers to help us get the word out, to educate people." So that was just one example where I said, "Oh, I'm so glad I connected with this group."
Wow.
And the other things are to help us with this new initiative, the Underrepresented Voter Project. We're going to need a ton of help, just, you know, social media help, getting the word out that this thing exists, and, you know, people can actually connect with different national groups this way, and you know, there's just a ton of work around that to do.
So in that realm, along those lines, I think what we want to do is we want to make sure that the people watching this show understand that there are some very tangible, real ways in which very doable things can be done to make a huge difference. This little mouse that roared, National Voter Corps, being recognized now nationally, that is exposing all of this rich resources, these rich resources throughout the country, and we can become people, our community can become part of it. Imagine how uplifting that is, given the stories that we've just heard about how just demoralizing it can be to have, well, we don't see race, everything's fine, we fixed all the problems, but we are actually addressing them, and it's quite an inspiration. So what we're going to do is we're going to put up a slide of what people can connect to get involved with National Voter Corps and to become part of this this movement. As we come to a close, I would like to hear a message, a pithy thing that you'd like to, any of you would like to say to the people who have an opportunity to join you.
I think I would like to say something, and that is I connected with people in a couple of the southern states. There's 3 of them to be exact, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Missouri. And each one I talked to, they were kind of ambivalent. They didn't want to really get involved, and we couldn't understand that, actually. In one office, the lady, there was only one person in there, so I understood her, but she connected me with other people. And in each of those states, each person separately told me the one thing you can do is help us have a voice. So what you're doing is very important.
Cool.
So that was very fulfilling.
Thank you, Nervana, and thank you all for joining us, learning more about what the mouse that roared can do.